Welcome to session 5 of 6 2020 Wonder Grant presentations. We're happy you could join us. So you might be asking, what is a Wonder Grant? At One Workplace, we're curious about the thinkers and the makers, about research and insights. We seek to explore the culture shifts and trends that impact the places where we work, learn, heal, and innovate. And we believe that when we partner with pioneers, experts, and disruptors, when we question the status quo, we do our best work. The kind of work that shapes the human experience and makes the built environment more meaningful and enjoyable. We introduced the Wonder Grant in 2019 to support exploration and research from the architecture and design community. Since then, we've awarded 9 Wonder Grants, 6 of which were awarded in 2020. I'm Chris Good, the creative director at One Workplace, and I'm honored to introduce one of the 2020 grant teams to you, Vital Architecture, now Nash Hurley Architecture Studio. As a support team, or as a support coach for this team, I've seen their work progress over the last 9 months, and I'm certain their results will challenge the way that you think about relationships between people, information, and organizations, especially as we adapt to a more distributed work experience. But before I introduce the team, let me share a few logistics. At the end of Vital's presentation, we will have a brief Q&A period moderated by my colleague and fellow Wonder Coach, Laura Ely. Throughout the presentation, the Q&A function will be open, so please put your questions there. We'll be sending out a recording of today's presentation within 24 hours, and will also be available on the Wonder Grant section of the One Workplace website. Now, to share their research, from nodes to links, applications of network science to workspace, please meet Josh Emig and Jorian Nash Hurley.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, now for the big moment. Chris, can you see my screen?
Not yet.
So, almost the big moment. The big reveal.
Big reveal
is coming. I think we are.
We are on your screen and perfect, ready to go.
All right, let's start cooking with gas. Well, we're really grateful to have had this opportunity to do a deep dive into network science, and also to have had the support from Chris and Laura in taking some very fuzzy ideas and making them more applicable to workspace. So we're going to go fast in this presentation. You guys should all be seeing a map of the US. It's a map of the US at night, and it shows the kind of networks of our urban fabric. Before we drop into this presentation, I just ask that everybody take 3 seconds, close their eyes, and imagine what you think of when you think of networks. Okay, that won't happen again in this presentation. There'll be a lot of information, but keep that in the back of your head. What is a network to you, and what could it mean to workspace? We began our research into network science to help us understand the forces that are shaping workspace today. We understand there's lots of different types of networks. There's networks that describe airlines that might be decentralized or scale-free networks. There are mesh networks that describe our highway systems. We knew that those networks were very different and they led to very different kinds of outcomes, but we didn't have great language or a way of approaching those topics. So we began with these 3 people, all on the call right now. We're a very small studio. We've all worked together for decades. And we started by doing a deep dive into a literature review with these books here that the full bibliography will be available in our white paper on the Wonder Grant site in the future. But really we were trying to get a sense of the different types of languages and bits and parts of what goes into network science. How could we take this topic that seemed to make sense for mathematicians and start making it a useful tool for us as people that operate with workspace. First takeaway to start to filter through that complexity is that There are essentially three types of networks that we ran across: centralized networks, decentralized networks, and distributed networks. People have different names for these networks. Some would call a centralized network a hierarchy, a decentralized network a network or hub, or a distributed network a random mesh. But the centralized, decentralized, distributed networks are useful broad categories. These first categories were first laid out by Paul Barron in 1964 when he was asked to come up with different types of network structures that would sustain our communication system in the event of a nuclear attack. And they still hold true today. They're based on math. Okay, we also see the same network structures in the organizational theory literature review that we did as part of this. General McChrystal's Team of Teams, which explains his efforts to take special forces and change it from a command and control structure into a decentralized network of a team of teams, really is describing the same type of transformation of network structure. And then in Anne-Marie Slaughter's Chessboard and the Web, we see very consistent attributes attributed to each of these networks. So centralized networks, which also could be called hierarchies, employee traits that are esteemable might be a deference to authority, obedience, conformity, whereas with a decentralized network, the employee traits that might rise to the top are more the ability to problem solve or collaborate or work autonomously. We see with centralized networks that title and rank and seniority tends to drive authority, whereas with a decentralized network, expertise and contribution is the basis for an individual's authority. And then I think this last part is really applicable to where we are today in terms of our time, that a centralized network performs very well and is very efficient in stable, predictable environments. And decentralized networks perform well in ambiguous environments. So there's nothing inherently oppositional between centralized and decentralized networks. These are just categories that explain a spectrum of network structure. But it is, we found it fascinating to see these kinds of human attributes in company cultures that could be described based upon just the structure of the network itself. Okay, so for those of you wondering how much network science were we able to process in our 6-month deep dive, we would give ourselves, and this is a self-scoring right here, a 2 out of 10 in terms of our knowledge of network science. We worked hard, we read a lot, we discussed, there were some arguments, but overall, we feel like we have a good sense of the vocabulary and the principles that go into network science and what that might mean for workspace. There's a whole lot more out there to know, and we'll give you guys some resources later on in the presentation for that.
So now we just want to jump in and talk a little bit about some of that vocabulary, just so we can be on a little bit more on equal footing. This is going to be largely simplified, but I think it really forms the basis of understanding how networks function. So the simplest definition of a network there is really is it's a set or a collection of objects or entities and the connections among those things. And so if you go look into any of this literature, you'll find that there's even different words for the different parts. We tend to use the terms node and link, the node to refer to those entities and the links to refer to the connections among those entities. And so network science tends to look at these connections. The connections are important because they really define a lot about what the network is. And those connections can actually be strong or weak. And what we find when we start looking at organizations is they facilitate different types of behaviors. And so as networks grow, if network science is anything, it's a way of describing complex systems. And so as networks grow, they become more increasingly complex, and they start to exhibit their own sort of structures and qualities that emerge from those. And so those structures and qualities of the nodes and connections really start to define what type of network it is and how those networks behave, and then the relationships among different parts of those networks. So we, as we all know here, we're focused our investigations with a bias toward what this this area of science could tell us about workspace. And so for our purposes, let's talk about a node. A node could actually be a lot of things. And that's one of the, one of the stronger, or this is what makes network science a powerful way of looking at the world, is that it offers a level of abstraction that is very, very flexible. It can be applied to a lot of different things. For our purposes, a node could be a single person. It could be a team. It could be a department. It could be an entire company. And so in this way, if you think about an organization or even an entire economy as a set of nodes and in a system of production, workspace in a way functions as a node. It's kind of a container for the productive capacity. And that could be a person connected to other people. It could be teams connected to other teams. It could be departments connected to other departments, all working in service of this network of production. A network is also defined by what flows across it. So these flows, which really kind of flow across the connections between these entities, they could be information, it could be water, it could be energy, it could be shipping containers, any number of things. And in workspace, these flows tend to be about information. The way that information flows in a work environment tends to dictate the relative productivity and effectiveness of those that work environment and those networks. So so we want to make this distinction. Obviously we tend to be a little bit focused on office, but we want to also call out the fact that workspace is not just offices. And so there are workspaces that focus on building physical things. And so for physical products, there's a lot more physical information involved in those systems. For digital products, we rely pretty heavily on the flow of digital information across our networks. And so for a long time, information flows really relied on physical proximity, and this is what our space reflects. So most work required early on, if you go back to the early 20th century, and prior to that, obviously, but most work really required the flow of paper-based information and a lot of face-to-face meetings. So in this way, workspace functions as a link. It's a facilitator of that proximity, the facilitator of the flow of paper, and the facilitator of meetings, and a number of other things like shared consciousness. And so it really is the connector among the nodes in the network. So over the last 30 years or so, obviously, we've developed a lot of new ways to create digital links among the nodes, and they've become ubiquitous. And in fact, a whole new sector of our economy filled with powerful companies have been formed to ensure the reliability of these links. And then in 2020, when COVID hit, this trend is obviously decades in the making and more, where we've become increasingly reliant on our digital networks for these links and these communications. But what COVID did for us in a big way was really turn the weight of the physical and the digital on its head. And so when this happened and the physical proximity became unavailable for a lot of people, information had options. And so we pushed our information, we pushed our links out into these other types of connections. And so now we're at an inflection point where we, in a way, get to decide how our workspace is going to function as part of our network of production. Is it going to be on more equal footing from here on out with the digital links? Is it going to function as a node, or is it going to function as a link, or a combination of the two? And so in order to try to bring this theory into the real world a little bit, we did a case study, and which was a super fun deep dive into the production of Wikipedia, which is one of my favorite products, and which is delivered through a pretty wholly distributed organization called the Wikimedia Foundation, as well as a network of contributors, volunteer contributors. And so Nash is going to take us a little bit more through that case study.
Great. All right, so we're assuming that most people are familiar with Wikipedia, but we wanted to give some basic information about it before dropping into our findings from that case study. It was founded 20 years ago to build the sum of all knowledge for all people. The legal, institutional, and technical infrastructure for the website is run by a not-for-profit, which is important compared to other top 10 sites, the Wikimedia Foundation. The foundation was founded 2 years after the launch of Wikipedia itself. So the product, that is the Wikipedia product, was around for 2 years before the infrastructure. The network saw the need to create the foundation to provide the base infrastructure to continue to develop the product. The foundation does not edit, create, or otherwise determine what content exists on Wikipedia. The volunteer editors do, which we thought it's just an important point to call out in terms of causality of the network effects. Wikipedia is a product of a network of people. We'd ask you to kind of hold on to that concept. And it is wholly a digital product. There's no physical instantiation of Wikipedia today, at least. In terms of the number of nodes, to go through the thinking about both nodes and links, there are 280,000 active editors producing the product that we all engage with, that is Wikipedia. Sorry if you guys can hear sirens in the background, just downside of urban living. The foundation itself has 500 staff and contractors and 200 secure servers. So it's, we found it fascinating. There's 280,000 volunteers with only 500 staff and contractors through the foundation that are distributed globally with clusters in San Francisco and in New York. The San Francisco hub has a capacity of only about 150 people to that 500, supporting those 280,000 volunteer editors. It also has space for about 15 people in DC. On any given day, pre-pandemic, they were only seeing about 25% of their capacity being used in their San Francisco office. So really, it's a fully distributed organization and had been operating in that way for the past 20 years. Here are a few things that we learned about the production of the Wikipedia product using the network lens as a tool. I would say the thing that was a huge part of every stakeholder interview and top of our list of findings was that Wikipedia runs on trust. And everybody goes to great lengths to establish rituals that foster trust amongst the community. They build in time into meetings to make sure that people have a chance to chit chat. They schedule time to make sure everybody's heard, which takes a lot of time to make sure everybody's heard. And they have some, very clear taboos, that there's no pile-ons. If there's some sort of conflict, that there's a way to remedy that conflict without having, large email chains going around, eroding trust. And from a network perspective, this trust means that the network can be quite large because the cost of creating links is quite small. When you trust somebody, it's easy to connect to them. When you don't trust them, it raises the transaction costs of making that connection. So the production of Wikipedia also utilizes another thing to decrease the transaction costs of creating those links. It has very clear standards. So each has many different channels that I'm sure all of us have at our works, from Gmail to in-person meetings, but they also have talk pages, which is the medium actually used to create the Wikipedia product itself, with volunteer editors, Fabricator, which they use to schedule releases of and development of their product, and Asana and IRC. all these different channels have clear communication protocols, clear standards around them. So when you drop into that type of communication, you understand what type of content you're going to engage with. One of the biggest frictions that hits this very distributed organization is around time zones. Probably the number one friction that we heard in the production of Wikipedia was scheduling time for synchronous work, asynchronous work that could occur through talk pages or Google Docs. Didn't have that friction around it, obviously, but when there was need to have a softer conversation, more direct, time zones were a problem, non-trivial problem. So because so much is occurring digitally and has occurred digitally for the last 20 years, in-person communication is really thought about a little bit differently in the production of Wikipedia. They think of it as convening, coming together to address more complex information, like a new product launch, or to address some sort of conflict or in the community or topic that needs resolution. And unlike a lot of the hybrid models that we're all discussing in terms of workplace with a target of whether it's 2 or 4 days a week, the high trust culture of within the production of Wikipedia and the fact that it's a fully digital product allows them to only meet up quarterly. So they come together in groups of 10 or so every quarter. And we found a very clear relationship, which will be not surprising to anybody, that this cadence of convening is more often for smaller groups and less often for larger groups. And part of that is just due to the costs of that, bringing all those groups together, and coordination costs. So small group convening, they had very specific outcomes for the types of events that they would have for their team offsites on a quarterly basis. Using the network lens, we would frame this as establishing the bonding capital, the bonds required to develop complex products. So this is making sure that you've got a good shorthand and a very high level of trust with the specific small team that you're working with to evolve and develop your product. The large group convenings had a different outcome. They were, again, using our network lens, which said geared towards the bridging capital or the weak ties to bring in new ideas and new people intentionally into the network of production of Wikipedia. So that, with a smaller group, they're looking at the bonds between people. The larger group intentionally seeking out diversity of ideas, diversity of opinion, and starting a process for synthesizing that into the network of production. Booking travel for these offsites is one of the frictions that we saw for the as-needed small group convening. So, if there's a group of 10 people distributed globally, they have to come together. They're coming together currently on a quarterly basis, but one of the reasons for that is there's actually a good amount of friction to finding a room, a collaboration space, and the right hotel rooms in the city that represents the right values for them to continue to evolve their product. We think that we're going to see more of this as more organizations go to distributed platforms for their work, that there's going to be an opportunity for somebody to offer more space as a service for these small group gatherings. So trying to push forward to some of the larger opportunity areas that we already hinted at through our Wikipedia case study. We found that the lens of network science to be particularly useful for looking with fresh eyes at your own organization, to think about your product first, and to think about the types of information that's flowing to create your product and the links required to make that product. Most notably, here, we would call out a real strong difference between physical products and digital products when it comes to the flows within the network and what that means for their workspace. As we saw with the production of Wikipedia, really knowing your culture is also important in considering the levels of trust that exist within your organization. If you're a low trust culture, your ability to be a distributed network is really hampered. People are gonna tend towards centralizing in order to make sure that they have a sense of governance over people that they might not trust, because the cost of the links are high. Considering your space as both a node and a link of production, we think that's a really helpful kind of Janus of view of your own workspace. A lot of our work, I think, historically has grown up, and we have a lot of tools for thinking about a node of production, things that are made there, ideas that are created in a place, but there's also a different kind of logic when space becomes a link, bringing people together in the kind of convening example that we saw with the production of Wikipedia. And then I think that this is a little bit more abstract, but nonetheless real, that workspace has served as a really strong vehicle for shared consciousness. If you want to understand who a company actually is and what they're really all about, checking out their space has been a tried and tested process. But it also, the space communicates to its employees, to its workers as a broadcast medium in and of itself. And when you take away that workspace and you go to a distributed format, thinking about other types of mediums, whether it's an internal broadcast, could be daily, could be weekly, but really ultimately what you're trying to get to from a network perspective is a sense of shared consciousness, where people feel like they have a good sense of the heartbeat of the organization. And when that is a distributed organization and is not being done primarily through the workspace, it needs to be done in through other means. And, in terms of thinking through what that is, space, if anything, it's very honest. When you look at a person's workspace, you can see their values. So thinking about those kind of communication tools through a similarly honest and genuine lens, that you're influencing with quality, information, transparency, not through a polished internal kind of comms package, we think is a real opportunity. And Josh?
Yep, a few of our recommendations have to do with just thinking about how to handle workspace slightly differently as a part of a network of production. So make workspace flexible so it can adapt to the needs of your network. Again, something that I think has been trending for quite a long time has really been reinforced by COVID. But we understand that rigidity at both the urban scale and the floor plan scale adds friction to the adaptation of the network. And so rather than focusing on what the build is or what's going into the build, we recommend taking a step back and thinking about the workspace as a service, and think about what those services provide to your production network in terms of linking, in terms of flows of information, in terms of potentially strategic modifications to a network structure that will allow it to function differently. And so thinking about really simply just investing in spaces and assets that afford those services in a way that allows them to evolve. And so companies are going to need to continue to adapt. We're at a strange place right now. We're not really sure what's going to happen when we go back. We talk about hybrid workplace, we talk about all these things, but ultimately if there's any sort of constant in all of that, as they say, it will be the need to change. And so sort of investing in spaces and assets that actually accommodate change versus trying to reinforce a static structure is the recommendation there. And then lastly, for people, we know that a lot of people tend to have been shown to be more productive to a point when they're distributed, but it's also been shown to have some diminishing returns. And so to think about over time, not just how we reinforce connection through convening, but also how we allow people some agency and choice in how and where they work, so they can maintain that level of engagement. So that might be, in addition to like having like clear standards and rituals, maybe it's investment in sort of allowances for things like kits that allow people to work remotely from home in the way that best suits them, or allows them to make choices about where they work. And ultimately what that means for organizations is that they should consider real estate costs more holistically as a bundle with things like travel budgets and allowance for these kinds of services and kits, and set up service agreements with other organizations that will serve as a distributed organization. And so that really, again, thinking about how we service a network of production versus how we focus on a single sort of static structure. So the closing point I think we wanted to make was that, you don't have to be an expert to engage with this kind of network mindset. There's a basic sort of vocabulary, there's a basic understanding of looking at organizations and looking at workspaces as networks that is fairly easy to adopt and to understand. However, there are also a lot of people out in the world, and the technical term is organizational network analysis. If you feel like this is a real potential for your organization or any of your clients' organizations, there's a lot of great people out there in the world that are doing this with a high degree of rigor and depth, and they're mathematically sound and statistically sound, and have really built both organizations and careers around organizational network analysis. And so, like we said, we're probably like a 2 out of 10. A lot of these folks are 10. We interviewed Ben Weber of Humanize. He was fantastic and helped us out a lot. Cesar Hidalgo from Data Wheel, who wrote one of the books that we use very heavily. Like these folks are very good. So if there's anybody who's interested in sort of really delving deeper, please reach out to us, and we'd be happy to help you navigate some of this. This list of consultancies is also in our paper, and that'll be available as well. So
Josh, Nash, and Jory, thank you guys so much for sharing this new way of thinking about the connections and information flow within our work experiences and our workplaces. With the remaining time we have together, I would love to transition to my partner, Laura Ely, who can guide us into a moderated Q&A discussion. And so thank you guys so much. And Laura, if you wouldn't mind joining us to walk us through a little bit of Q&A.
Awesome. Great job, guys. Really, really good takeaways, and getting some good feedback on the Q&A. Just as a reminder, if anybody's got some questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A, and I'll be sure to bring them into the live conversation. But for the team of panelists, first question that we had was just, what are some steps that companies could take to practically adopt this new network mindset and framework for decision making? I think you suggested some, even around different changes to maybe investment in internal communication strategy or something like that. But what were some of the big takeaways that you would see organizations using in their decision making?
Okay, I'll go. So I think the first thing to do is to really think about what type of product you're producing. And obviously many organizations produce many different types of products, but the network analysis really helps you to work out from the product and get a sense of what the flows are required to produce that end product. An example that we found interesting, that we came across through our research, was a lifestyle magazine, and they were surprised that they had a strong forcing function to centralizing, to all being in the same space, even though there was, I think, a cultural desire, very high trust, great communication. But there was a tendency to come together because at some point they all have to touch and feel the same products and take photographs of those products for their publication. And so that physical component to what ultimately becomes a digital product, but was really shaping their workspace needs. So I think start with the product is probably the top recommendation that we would have, and think about how much of it is dependent upon physical or digital components.
Very good. Josh, anything you'd add? I saw you come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd add also, it does take a degree of honesty about the organization that you're in. And so it's really easy to look at an org chart and say, oh, this is a network. This is how information flows, but it's actually not true. And there's actually some really interesting studies around informal information flow versus sort of sanctioned and sort of organizational structure. They tend to be very different. And so I think one of the things that we've seen, especially with like the pandemic, is, and we've mentioned this before, is that command and control type organizations that operate more top down and potentially have lower trust tend not to work as well in a distributed way. And so I think that some of the ways that you can think about moving to something distributed would be to look at your standards, look at your rituals. Can your organization function without being face-to-face? Being face-to-face does a lot of work, just in terms of like keeping people aligned and keeping people aware. And so if you don't have the kind of trust and the communications in place that would support not being face-to-face, I think it becomes very difficult. So I would pay very close attention to those things.
Yeah. I love that point that you all were making about the foundational kind of cultural attributes almost that you have to have in order for this to be successful. And it leads me to another question that somebody asked, kind of expanding on that idea of the importance through the pandemic of really great communication links, as you called them. Somebody asked, did your research lead you to study kind of any new evolutions or any new adaptations beyond the channels that you mentioned, like Slack and Zoom and Teams and that type of thing, related to kind of new communication tools that are being considered by organizations, or really as organizations are trying to not just rely on standard means of communication? Wondered if it led you to any interesting research on new ways of communicating for the organization that's looking to stay mostly digital.
I could take a shot at that. I mean, I can't think of anything specific that we came across that was new, but just to kind of, and I'm going to be a little bit redundant to reinforce a point, which was one of the things that really jumped out at us, especially in the case study, had to do with like this idea of standards and protocols. And so it in a way, it didn't so much matter what the medium was, as much as it mattered that there were sort of clear expectations about how to communicate through that medium. And I think that that's a sort of general kind of principle that can apply across the board. And so you even start to see that now with organizations thinking about how to manage Zoom calls. How many is too many, like, and what, there's real burnout from that. And so like starting to build structures, it's a little bit counterintuitive because we're talking about sort of something we think of as being distributed or decentralized, but it really requires this structure in order to kind of function and make those communications pathways function. So that would be my answer, that it's in terms of like something new or sort of seemed a little bit more surprising to me. That was something that jumped out. But I don't know that we have any new channels. Do we have any new channels, Jory or Nash?
I don't know that this isn't necessarily related to a new channel that would like be up and coming and generally available, but something else that we saw through the case study that was interesting was that that Wikimedia does have certain channels that like it has itself created. So it has kind of a variety of channels ranging from channels that it has itself created that have a high degree of kind of like open source type thinking, where they're very transparent, and the level of trust that exists in communication that flows through those channels is extremely high. And then as you move into some of the channels that are privately commercial private companies, the feeling of trust related to communication that's like happening through those channels, it starts to degrade a little bit. And that was partly, I think, specific to the incredibly high trust, incredibly transparent culture that we see at the Wikimedia Foundation and in the Wikipedia community as a whole. So that might not always generally apply. And then the second piece that related to kind of the sustainability of different communication channels in an increasingly distributed workforce would be that certain communication channels have more of an insider feeling and are harder to access and get up to speed for newcomers, whether it's a new hire to the organization. It can take them a long time to understand the norms, to feel comfortable and to be productive, contributing on certain communication channels, and certain communication channels that are more closely held and dominated by like potentially a tighter group that has used that channel in a way that's very productive for them, but can be alienating and prevent contribution. So I thought those were just kind of like themes about the way that groups are using communication channels that came to the fore a lot in the case study and would probably be reflected in other organizations.
Yeah. Jory, I love that ad. Somebody had actually asked a question about, are there different types of connections that are deemed more trustworthy? And I think, as you said, it's those that maybe allow more of that open collaboration, open participation. So really good. To this comment, somebody just asked a question sort of, the application of this research, or what application do you think this research might have then, if a lot of this research is pointing to the fact that, high trust needs to be in place in order for these connections to be successful? What changes do you anticipate will practically happen in physical workplaces to be able to make more open communication? Will changes be made? What do you project?
Do you want me to step in it, Josh? Do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I was just giving you a chance. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think the title of our slide, of our deck was kind of pointing in that direction, of like thinking about space as a link. I think we have a lot of habit. I mean, habit drives a lot of our decision making. And so I think we naturally know how to make a desk that functions and holds paper and does things like that. But making, spaces that are links, when there are so many other options for handling basic information, I think is really a good question to ask yourself. Like, can you, sight lines, I think, rise exponentially in their importance. Having places for small group discussion. I would say a big opportunity area that we see is, partly some sort of blurring between hotels and workspace, where a lot of the hotels, they have their space for a gathering is 150 plus, because it's a great department size. It's also the size of a wedding, because that's the kind of sizes that they've accommodated in the past. But the frequent size and scale that we saw was the 10 to 15 person software production group at Wikipedia. That's who's coming together often and needs a place to gather. So that could be done through a hotel type service, or it could be done in your own workspace that you own. But really focusing in on that smaller scale collaborative space, I think, is an opportunity area.
Yeah, I love that adaptation based on the way of who's using the space. So guys, I know that brings us close to the end of our time. So Chris, I'll turn it to you.
Well, thank you, Laura, and a super special thank you to Josh, Jory, and Nash, and to all of you who are on the call who shared this session with us. The Wonder Grant presentations will continue next Tuesday at 11:30 for our final Wonder Grant presentation. And remember, the Wonder Grant 2021 applications are now open, and they will remain open through June 18th, 2021. We'd love to hear your ideas and your submissions. Thank you all so much. Josh, Jory, Nash, much gratitude, and thank you all.